Lovely starshine lights my way to bed. Magic rainbows glisten in my head. Just like a child, I live in Wonderland. All my dreams are...
Hi, and welcome to Handmade by Ditsy Tulip. I'm Mel, and thanks for stopping by. In today's video, this is part one of hopefully a two-part video where I'm going to show you step by step how I make a little jointed sweet little toy like this. It's not this one that I'm going to be making. I can't show you because I've not got him finished yet, but it's a sweet little elephant. You may have seen in a previous video I shared that I'd completed this cute little jointed bear, and a few people had said that they would love to see how they are created, and I'd got a new little kit on the way, which is this little elephant. So I said that I would film snippets of video as I make him up so that I can show you. It obviously is quite a lengthy process because they're fully sewn by hand, so I will need to split the video up, otherwise it'll be too long to upload in one go. So in this video I'm going to share the first steps with you. I will include a link in the video notes on the kit that I purchased. Of course, I'll be showing you the full kit details in a second, but I will include a link to this in the video notes. It's from a sweet little shop called Noble Fabrics on Etsy. It's not sponsored at all. I've paid full price for these kits myself. I do highly recommend them. They're real good quality, but the instructions are quite sparse, hence creating these videos. There's also limited supplies of each kit available, so you may find that there's none of the elephant kits left, but there may be other kits, and they'll all kind of follow similar type principles when you're putting them together. So let's get started. Let's start by taking a look at what comes in the kit. Okay, so let's just show you what's inside this little elephant kit. So here he is, a little cutie. So I've got the instructions. So they are pretty basic written instructions. There's no kind of photographs showing you step by step what to do or anything like that. It is just basic written instructions, so not all that detailed. Here's the pattern. So not many pattern parts. I've just got his head, his body, his legs, his arms and his ears, and I'll fully sew this by hand, and you can see there's a couple of little darts that I need to sew as well. Then looking at the materials, so this is the main fabric. It's really nice and soft, and I'm not sure if you can see on the camera, but it's grey but with like a pinky tinge, and that's what it looks like on the back. What's really important to note when you come to cut out the pattern pieces is which way the direction of the fur, because it's a bit like if you were sewing with velvet or something like that. If you put it with the pile in the wrong direction, then it's going to ruin the project. So that's important to note. There's the fabric that come with him for his ears. I'm not sure if I'll use this or whether I'll use some Liberty fabric from my stash. This is the little bell and string that will go around his neck. You've got a little piece of aging chalk, I think it's chalk, and that's what you use to kind of make him look a little bit vintagey. I will use this combined with some dry pastels that I've got as well. You've got the threads and the eyes. They're tiny little glass eyes which have got a little tinge of green. I'm not sure if you can see, but I don't want to get them out because if I lose it, then I'm going to struggle for eyes. And then you've got some thread in there as well, so some black thread for adding some little details, and some grey thread where you need extra strength thread, where you sew together the openings that you leave for stuffing. Then these are the discs and cotter pins. So these are what you use to make him fully jointed. These larger ones are for the head and neck. And then these smaller ones are for the arms and legs. So I'll show you more about what you do with these when I get to those stages. Okay, so now we've looked at what's in the kit, let's have a look at what other tools and supplies you will need. Some of these are essential, some of them aren't, but may be helpful, so I'll share with you which ones aren't essential. So you'll need some kind of sewing thread and a hand sewing needle. I'm just using kind of standard all-purpose Gutterman thread, and I use that doubled up. Sometimes you do find when you're sewing with doubled up thread it may tangle, so you can get specialist kind of hand sewing extra strong threads. So just whichever thread you've got in, or if you're buying it specially, then of course you could get one that's more tailored for use. You'll need some kind of standard pen, and that's just for tracing round your pattern pieces and transferring them onto card. So you'll then need a piece of card and a light box if you've got one. I have got a light box, so I'll show you how I use that when I get to that stage. But you don't need a light box, you could just hold it up against a window or something like that if you don't have one. You will need some sharp scissors. Now ideally you'd want small scissors. My small scissors have gone a bit blunt and wouldn't cut through that fabric, so I'll just use those for snipping thread. But you'll need some nice sharp scissors for cutting out the pattern pieces. This isn't essential, but could be helpful, is either a hole punch or a large needle. I just can't think what type of needle this is called, and this is when you're piercing the fabric to add the cotter pins. It can make it easier if you've got something either that or that to pierce the fabric. It can make it easier. You'll then need something to help you to turn the small pattern pieces right side out after you've sewed them. What I use is a straw. So this is a plastic straw and a bodkin. Again, you can buy lots of specialist tools for turning things right side out, like surgical pliers. There is something that's specifically for turning bits of toys right side out. I can't just think what it's called, but this is what I use, a bodkin and a straw. Ultimately, it doesn't need to be a bodkin, you just need something that's firm, that's rounded at the end so that it doesn't pierce the fabric. And finally, you'll need something to stuff him with. You can just use standard polyester stuffing, but what I like to use is felting wool, just because I think it gives him a little bit more definition and makes it feel a little bit more high quality. But basically you can just use whatever you get your hands on. And that is it. Next, I'm going to explain how I trace out the pattern and transfer that onto the fabric. Okay, so here is the pattern. What I'm going to be doing first of all is tracing this onto cardboard, and I'm going to use a light box to do that. If you don't have a light box, you can hold it up against a window, or you may be able to just put a sheet of card over the top and see it through. Now what I'm going to do is trace directly over the line, because that will then become the stitch line. I won't add seam allowance at this stage. I add the seam allowance when I come to cut out the pattern piece onto the fabric, which I'll show you in just a second. Just to show you how I use the light box, so you can see here, I literally just trace over the line with a mechanical pencil, and that's it. Now let's look at transferring the pattern to the fabric. Okay, so I've got all the pattern pieces now transferred to card. What I've done is added a grain line arrow on each of the pattern pieces because I did notice that wasn't on this one. So to make sure that I put it in the right direction on the fabric. So just to show you that, so here's the selvage. And I can see that the grain of the fabric is running downwards in that direction. So that's all I'll just make sure that I do when I draw around these, is making sure that the arrow is lined up with the selvage and that it's going in the right direction, so it's coming down the fabric this way. So what I'm going to do now is draw around the edge of each of the pattern pieces. I need to make sure I leave enough gap between each of the pattern pieces to make sure I can cut off a seam allowance as well. So I'm going to do that now and then I'll be back to show you. Oh, actually one other thing that's really important is ensuring that you reverse the part. So you can see here I need to cut out 2 of these, but they're reversed, so I'll trace round one that way and then I'll reverse it round and trace one round the other way as well. What I'll probably do is transfer that grain line arrow onto the wrong side of the pattern piece as well. So I'll be back shortly. Okay, so before I move on to the rest, I just wanted to show you these so you can see I've traced directly round the piece, ensuring that the line is matched up with the selvage. And then I've also transferred the pattern markings, so you can see I've got the lines there, which is what you leave open for stuffing. And then I've just punched a hole through where the eye marking was, so that makes it easy to transfer onto the fabric as well. And then I've made sure that I've turned the pattern piece round for when I've done the reverse, and I've just transferred the grain line mark and the marks for where I leave the fabric open. So I'm going to repeat that now with the rest of the pattern pieces. Now that I've traced around all of the pattern pieces, I'm going to show you what that looks like with the seam allowance added when it's been cut out. Okay, so now I've cut out all the pattern pieces, so just to show you what I've done there. So there's the line that I drew when I drew directly around the card, and there's the pattern markings, and then all I've done is left a small seam allowance as I've trimmed that out. There's no set size for the seam allowance. You don't want it to be too big because you don't want it to be really bulky. I don't know what size I just eyeballed it, to be honest. It's perhaps a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. And you don't need to worry too much about it being dead even all the way around, because you're going to be hand sewing anyway, and you're going to use this stitch line as your guide for where you stitch, not the seam allowance line, so you don't need to worry about it too much. So I've done that on all of the pattern pieces. Be prepared to get absolutely covered in fluff because it flies everywhere, and that's it. So I'll move on to the next step. Let's have a look at how we add tailor's tacks so that we can easily see where the eyes and cotter pins need to be added. So before I start the sewing, one thing I'm going to do is add tailor's tacks to make it easy to see these little markings once it's constructed. So these little dots are basically the guidelines for where you add the cotter pins, where you're joining the joints together. And what I found when I last made my bear is it was impossible to see where they were once I'd stitched it together and turned it right side out. So what I'm going to do is add little tailor's tacks so that I can see where that is. If you're not familiar with a tailor's tack, all it simply is threading the needle with a double thread, but you don't tie a knot in the end. Then I'm simply going to pull the thread through where the dot is, leave a little bit of a tail, pulled it a bit too much there, leave a little bit of a tail on the front and on the back. and snip it off. So then, because there's no knot tied in there, they'll be really easy to move. But what I can see once I've stitched them together and turned them right side out is I can see where I need to add that cotter pin. What I think I will need to do is make those much smaller, because otherwise it's going to get tangled up in the stitches when I sew the piece together. But I just wanted to show you how I do that. So I'm going to do that for all the other pattern pieces where there's any kind of dot where I need to either add the eyes or add the cotter pins. Now we're ready to start sewing. I'm going to start with the arms and legs so that I can show you what type of stitch that I use, and then I'll move on to the head and body. Okay, so I'm going to show you now how I do the hand stitching. So you can see here I've got one of the arms and I've already stitched this. So just a couple of things to point out to start off with is it's important you've transferred the markings from the pattern so you know which areas to leave unstitched, and that's so you can turn it the right side out and stuff it. And then I've just used kind of a small hand back style stitch, so that's what it looks like on that side, and you can see that's what it looks like on the other side. And then just note I've got the little tailor's tacks to show where I put the discs and cotter pins afterwards. So all I'm using is standard also Gutterman thread, but I'm using that at a double. I've doubled it up on the needle. I've got just a standard hand sewing needle, and I don't really ever work with more than one arm's length of thread, which then gets doubled, because if you work with any more than that it tends to get tangled. And just one other tip that I wanted to share to help keep the stitch size even is I put a little mark on my thumb. So this is I'm right-handed, so this is my left hand, and this is how I hold the fabric when I'm sewing. So them little marks on my thumb, you'll see as I do it in a second, just help me kind of move it along as I do a stitch, and it just helps me to keep a consistent stitch size as well. So I've got the arm here that hasn't yet been stitched, so you can see there are my markings for where it won't get stitched. So I'm putting them right sides together. And I'm going to start here from the back of the fabric. Now this is your stitch line. If you can see on this one here, the stitches run along that stitch line, and then I've got the seam allowance on the outside. So let's just show you how I do this. So I'm going to start punching through on the wrong side of the fabric, and you can turn it over to make sure that you're on that stitch line, but as you get going you don't need to worry about that too much. So I'm pushing in and pulling, and then going to use the little mark on my thumb to get the right stitch length. So I'm going to line up that first line with where the threads come out, and then I know that I want to put the needle back in again where the other line is, and I'm on that biro line again. Just make sure the edges of your fabric stay together, because it's difficult really to add pins because it's that tiny. You could add pins, but I don't bother. So then I'm going back down through the stitch line at the back and pull. Pull slowly, because if you pull too quickly, that's when your thread will start to knot. So there's my first little stitch. I'm then going to move my thumb down again, so this first line is even with the end of that first stitch, and then I'm coming back up again from the bottom where the line is on my thumb, quite difficult for me to do this because I'm having to look at the camera to see where I am, whereas normally I'd have this right up next to my eyes. So I'm back up and pull. Just watch that it doesn't knot on the back and just give it a little tug and then untangle if it does. And then I'm going back in that, pretty much in that hole where that stitch started. So I'm going to go back in there from the top. And pull. So there's my first back stitch. So I'm going to carry on doing the same. So I'm moving my thumb down now to the end of this stitch. I'm going to come up through the back of the fabric where the second line is on my thumb. Again, just check it doesn't tangle on the back. And then I'm going back down where this stitch, previous stitch, ended. And again, I'll do a couple more to show you. So I'm moving my thumb along now to where that stitch ended. I'm coming up through the back next to the second line on my thumb. Pull the thread through. And back down again on my previous stitch. And then just carry that all the way along. You can see on that one I've gone a little bit wonky. As I say, it's because I can't get close enough because I'm showing you what I'm doing. I'm looking over the top of my camera, but I'm not too worried about that anyway. So I'll just carry that on all the way around until I get to the other end. If you run out of thread part way through, then that's fine. You just need to kind of tie off the thread where it ends and then start again. What I'll do is I'll show you that as I get to it. Okay, so just to show you where I probably wouldn't have run out of thread on this, but just to show you what I do if I do run out of thread. This is the stitching that I've done so far, and that's what it looks like on the back. So I'm simply going to knot this off just by kind of putting a stitch into itself and pulling the needle through the loop. And I'll do that twice. And then snip it off. And then I'm just going to rethread my needle and then I'll continue with the stitching. So I'll show you that in a sec. Okay, so I've got my needle rethreaded, so I will just carry on with this now. So I'm going to start, as I did before, pushing the needle through on the wrong side, and I will start that stitch where my last stitch ended. So I'm just there. And then I'm just going to carry on as I did before. I've not put my little mark on my thumb yet today, but just to show you. And I shall just carry on as I did before until I get to that line there, and then just knot it off at the end to finish it. And then what I'm going to do is repeat that process on the legs. Now, just be mindful with the legs, they aren't two separate pieces, they come like this. So all you simply need to do is fold that over on itself so that it's right side to right side. And then do the same process as you've just done, do the stitching, but start at the little notch there and go all the way around to there. You don't need to stitch this side because it's folded, there's no seam. So I will get that stitched up, and then there's just one more thing that I want to show you in part 1 of this video. So now let's look at how to turn these tiny limbs right side out. Okay, so what I'm now going to show you is how to turn these tiny little limbs right side out. There's different tools that you can use and there's different methods that you can use, but what I'm going to do is use a straw. Now this is quite a firm plastic type straw, and I've also got a bodkin. It doesn't need to be a bodkin, but ideally what you want is something that's quite sturdy and that's got a rounded edge. So you can see on my bodkin I've got the kind of eye end there and the ball end there. And all I'm going to do is insert the straw into the opening that's left unstitched. I'm going to push that through all the way to the bottom. Then what I'm going to do is take the bodkin, the rounded end of the bodkin, and just push in a little. So the fabric is going a little bit inside the straw, and then kind of push it up a bit with your fingers. You won't be able to go all the way. Then you'll see the straw will fall out. And because you've made a start then, it's easy to just carry on pulling with your fingers. And use the bodkin just to push out any little nooks and crannies. That's why you really need to use something with a rounded end, because if you were using, say, the pointy end of a knitting needle, for example, you may pierce the fabric. And that is it. That has now turned right side out. So I'm going to do that with all the other limbs, and then in the next video we're going to move on to the head and body. Okay, so that's progress so far. That's part 1 of the tutorial video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Any questions at all about anything that I've covered, then just ask them in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon with part 2. It should be with you within the next 2 weeks. I'm progressing, making the elephant and filming it as I go, but then of course I need to edit the video and get it uploaded to YouTube. So it should be with you, I would say, within the next 2 weeks, because I'm not that far off finished actually making the elephant. So have a wonderful week, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!
All my dreams are coming, all my dreams are humming.